Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Tuesday, March the 8th, and today we have a fascinating story to tell you. If you have not read it yet on AL.com this morning, you absolutely should. We're going to link the story right here in our comment thread, but this is a story by our reporter, Amy Yerkinen, who is joining me here today, and it is about an Alabama man, specifically from Andalusia, who was convicted in 1985 of killing his wife. That conviction was largely based off of bite mark evidence. Fast forward 37 years later, and that expert who testified for that bite mark evidence for the prosecution is now recanting his testimony, and his attorneys are looking for a new trial. Amy, that is a very nutshell version of this case. There are a lot of ins and outs, many of which you covered in this story. I know some of which you couldn't, but there's a lot going on here. So let's start at the beginning, and then we will work our way towards what is happening today and what the appeals court is looking at in the case, of Charles McCrory. So let's start out about Charles McCrory, his case, and his wife, Julianne Bonds.
Yeah, so this murder occurred in May of 1985. Miss Bonds and Mr. McCrory were married at the time. They had a young son, and her body was discovered by her father-in-law, and Miss Bonds was the victim of just a brutal killing. She had injuries all over her body. Fatal wounds were to the back of her head, described as chop marks. She also had quite a few injuries on her upper chest. Those were puncture wounds, deep puncture wounds. This was brutal. There were defensive marks on her hands, her nails, her knees. But that is basically what happens. Her father-in-law called in to the authorities when he found her body, and her husband was working as a volunteer EMT at the time. So he heard the call in his neighborhood and responded to the scene. According to his attorneys, voluntarily consented to interviews, searches of his car, searches of his person, all his clothing, everything like that. And then months later was tried and convicted to life in prison for her murder. And as you mentioned, largely based on teeth mark evidence. Among the many injuries to her body were 2 marks to her upper right arm. When the medical examiner looked at those, he thought that they might be teeth marks. So he sent them off to an expert in Florida, Dr. Richard Souveron. He is one of the pioneers of forensic odontology, and he really rose to prominence during the Ted Bundy trial. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but one key piece of evidence against Ted Bundy in the murder of a Florida State University student was a bite mark that was left on her body that matched with Mr. Bundy's very crooked teeth. That was very compelling testimony in that case, and one of the reasons that he was convicted. Obviously, there was a lot of other evidence. So that happened 6 years before Charles McCrory was arrested. Same expert testified at McCrory's trial and submitted a report basically saying, in the report, he basically said these could be teeth marks and they look to be about the same distance apart as Mr. McCrory's teeth. At trial, his testimony, according to court documents, was a little bit more definitive. The lawyers asked him, are these bite marks from Mr. McCrory? And he answered, yes, teeth marks from Mr. McCrory. Mr. Souveron has walked a lot of that back. He said even his initial report, in which he said, there's the potential that these could be Mr. McCrory's teeth marks. He has since said that he wouldn't even go that far at this point. It's unclear whether these marks on Miss Bond's body were teeth marks, and it's very, impossible to really link them to anyone in particular, especially Mr. McCrory. You can't rule anyone out, but you also can't rule anyone in based on what they have.
Right. And so, I want to just quickly recap that for anybody too just joining us. So Miss Bonds was found dead in her home in Andalusia in 85. Her then husband, Charles McCrory, was later convicted that same year of her killing, largely based on a lot of this testimony from this expert who just 6 years before had testified in that Florida case against Ted Bundy, saying that the bite marks on a Florida State University student had those marks matched Ted Bundy's bite, essentially, his mouth. So that same expert comes to testify at Mr. McCrory's trial. And what he says is actually a little bit different from what he says in his report. His report that he submitted prior to the trial said they could be bite marks and was a little bit more wishy-washy. Then he gets on the stand, and you included part of the quotes from that trial transcript in your story where he says, yes, these are bite marks, and yes, they could be from Mr. McCrory. So I think it's fair to say that Mr. McCrory was sent to prison again for life, primarily based on that. Especially, I know now the son, who was 3 at the time that his mother was killed and his father was put in prison. Now he's about 40 years old, and he says that there, to his knowledge, was never any other physical evidence that tied his dad to the killing of his mom. He says there was no blood, there was no, from the sounds of it, this Miss Bonds died a brutal death. He says there was no blood. He says there was nothing that tied his dad directly to the scene. So it's fair to say that that testimony, that bite mark testimony, was really kind of the linchpin for Mr. McCrory.
Yeah, that's certainly the argument that McCrory's attorneys are making. And it's, looking through the case, McCrory did consent to searches. There was not blood or tissue found on him. There were hairs in Miss Bond's hand when she died, and McCrory was ruled out as someone who would have contributed those hairs. They may have matched Miss Bond's hair. That is one thing that they found, but they certainly did not match Mr. McCrory according to the analysis done at the time. I'm unclear how much physical evidence remains from this case. This obviously happened before DNA testing was widespread, and I believe none of the evidence. I'm not clear on how much of it may have been retained or tested. Since then, I understand that in the past, Mr. McCrory has put requests into the court to have that evidence retained so it could be tested again in the future. But yeah, there's the evidence against Mr. McCrory was the bite marks. And also there were 2 eyewitnesses, a grandfather and grandson, who were at the same house, who said that they saw a car that looked like Mr. McCrory's at the house around the time potentially of the murder, early the morning that her body was found. Now, again, Mr. McCrory's attorneys have challenged that evidence, basically saying that the one witness who's still alive, wouldn't have had the vantage point from his home to be able to see that far, to clearly see a car. They found witnesses who said there was no car at the time. So that evidence is a little bit, there's some contention over it, but the evidence that's there are the 2 witnesses stating that his car was at the scene, along with the bite mark testimony. So that is basically the crux of the case, as far as I understand it.
So let's fast forward. That's 1985. Let's fast forward to today. We know now that Mr. McCrory's defense team is wanting a new trial after, again, that bite mark expert, we'll call him, has recanted his testimony, saying that he would not testify today and say that he believed that those were Mr. McCrory's bite marks as he did in 1985. So you pull in his recanted testimony, and Mr. McCrory's lawyers say, look, we want a new trial. The state court actually denied that. They said, nope, you are not getting a new trial. So right now we are waiting on, I believe, the Alabama Criminal Court of Appeals to make a decision on that. Is that correct?
That's not exactly. So right now this case is still at the circuit court level. There was a petition for a new trial. They had a hearing last year in which they heard the evidence. And then it was basically Valentine's Day of this year, the judge in the circuit court ruled that he would not grant a new trial. The next step for his attorneys was to ask the judge to reconsider that decision. So where we are right now is that judge still has a little bit of time to reconsider that decision. So the circuit judge still has the power to grant Mr. McCrory a new trial. Um, if that doesn't happen, if he doesn't respond, or if he chooses to say no again, then his attorney's next steps would be to appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeals. It's not at that level yet, still at the circuit court, but that would be the next place it goes, probably, when the circuit court, like in the next week or two, if there's no ruling or if the circuit judge rules against it.
So that's a good, I'm glad you made that distinction. So the state court and the state circuit court judge has said, no, you're not getting a new trial. The defense team says, think about it a little bit more. Let us know. Try again. So we are waiting on again to see if that state judge is going to change his mind and allow for a new trial, or if he's just not going to respond, or again, option 3, say my prior ruling stands, there will not be a new trial. At that case, then we would expect again Mr. McCrory's defense team to appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeals. So that's a good distinction. It's still at the state court level, but it's not out of the realm of possibility to think this could go up a little bit higher.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't know what will happen. Obviously, with these things, judges don't talk to reporters about cases. So, he has ruled, in the past month that he should not have a new trial, but he has been asked to reconsider that. So there is still time for him to change his mind. And if not, the next step would be the Court of Criminal Appeals.
What does Miss Bond's family say about this? Again, we know that the two were married at the time, and also we know that their then 3-year-old child is now about 40 years old. And he says that he didn't know of any physical evidence aside of the bite marks that was used to convict his father. So, what does Miss Bond's family say, and what does their child say about this?
Well, I have not heard from her family. I do know that at the time of the original trial in 1985, they actually paid for private counsel to assist with the prosecution of Mr. McCrory. So, back in 1985, obviously they had a strong belief in his guilt in this case. The child, Chad McCrory, was raised by his father's parents. So he went in their custody. And he said growing up, he was always encouraged to just keep an open mind on the case. Obviously, it's a very difficult position to be in. He has a father in prison and his mother is gone. So he said over the years, as he's looked into this case, he has not found reasons to believe that his father is guilty. And he said he has, really been open to people making that case to him, but he has just reached a point of believing that his father is not guilty of this crime, and believes that at the very least he deserves a new trial with all the evidence except the bite mark evidence that has been recanted. And I should add that it wasn't just Dr. Suveron who recanted his testimony. There were 2 other forensic odontologists who submitted affidavits in this case, basically saying, that the field had changed so much that they, as forensic odontologists, also believed that this testimony from back in 1985, really would not be supported today. So there are 3 forensic odontologists who are basically saying, this evidence just doesn't jibe with what we know right now. Like it's what we thought at the time, but it is not what we think today, now that the science has advanced in this field. So one of those is Dr. Suveron, the original expert witness. And then there are other 2 on top of him who are quite well known in the field who have also said, this evidence is just not valid anymore.
Well, and we know science changes, science evolves, and technology has changed immensely in the past 37 years. That it's night and day from where we were then. So, question along that same point is a question here from Diana, and she says, "I wonder if there's anything in the evidence file that can be analyzed for DNA. You mentioned earlier DNA testing is was pretty non-existent at the time in 1985. So you fast forward to 2022, there are so many things now that can be tested for DNA. There's so many tests that can be done even outside of DNA. So what do we know about that, if there is any testing going on, or if there's anything left that can be tested?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I would, a lot of bite mark cases have been overturned based on DNA evidence. That was one of the things that sort of led to the investigation into forensic odontology as a field. There were several cases in the early 2000s or 90s when DNA testing became more prevalent, where there were defendants, or folks who had been convicted who had maintained their innocence, who had those cases overturned after DNA evidence came to light. So at that point, researchers from the National Academy of Sciences started to look into this. And what they found was that there were problems in a lot of forensic science fields, but I think they really saved their harshest criticism for the field of forensic odontology. And they found that a lot of these bite mark cases just weren't holding up to scrutiny. That there just was not a lot of scientific backing for some of the statements that had been made in court, and that they just could not find sort of a consistent. If you put basically what one of the research studies found is if you put a bunch of experts in a room and you gave them all the same photos to analyze, they were coming up with very different conclusions. There was no consistency in what they were finding. So, that was, you know, very problematic. And that has led to a lot of sort of rethinking of these cases over the years. As for whether they preserved evidence from this case, I'm not sure. I don't know whether anything has still been preserved to be tested. That would obviously shed a lot of light on Mr. McCrory's guilt or innocence.
What does the state say in this? What do the prosecutors say? Why are they saying that Mr. McCrory does not deserve a news trial? Why are they saying that they still believe he is guilty?
Well, so I was not able to speak with officials from the district attorney's office, but in their filings, they have said that they have other evidence, basically the two eyewitnesses, that's compelling. And they said that, he still can't be ruled out as a person who might have contributed what they believe are bite marks on the body of Miss Bonds. So that is where they stand right now. They are fighting and having a new trial. They don't want it. They believe that they have the evidence to prove his guilt, and that evidence is still valid. So that's where they stand according to court filings.
But to be fair, other than those two witnesses, one who has now passed away, and then again that bite mark evidence, they don't specifically mention anything in those court filings of saying this is what we're pointing to, put away the bite marks, this is what we've got.
No, there's really nothing else in the documents that I've seen that beyond the bite marks and the witnesses that they cited.
This is something that I think is going to just really captivate people. Amy, when can we expect maybe any developments in this case?
I mean, I'll certainly be watching to see if the circuit court judge, makes a ruling on this petition to reconsider. And then after that, if it goes to the Court of Criminal Appeals, that process can be a little slower, as we know. But it'll be something that we'll be watching to see what happens. There are a lot of really interesting twists and turns in this case. There were things I really couldn't get to in this story, which was really heavily focused on the bite marks, given that the experts have, recanted their testimony. But it's a really interesting case. There's a lot to it. I'm definitely hoping to explore more about, some of the different angles that his attorneys have looked into over the years. And yeah, I'm hoping to definitely do some more stories on this case.
And it should be noted as well that over the years, Charles McCrory has denied several plea deals, including one, I believe, just last year that would have actually had him walk out of prison. He still would have had to admit guilt, and it would essentially be a plea deal, but he would have gotten essentially time served and walked out. And he did deny that plea deal. Is that right?
That's correct. He was offered that plea deal for time served. It's been, 37 years, almost 37 years since he went to prison. And he has said, according to his attorney, that he would not plead guilty to something he didn't do. So he rejected that and remains in prison right now.
Fascinating story, Amy. Thank you for your reporting and your deep dive on this. Again, we are putting the link here in the comment thread. If you would like to read more about that, please do. We're putting that link here. And again, Amy, hopefully you will have some updates and just some more deep dives on this case coming soon. So, Amy, thank you so much. Everybody watching, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you tomorrow.